I didn't realise that was going to be read out. I would have made it a lot shorter. I apologise. So I'm a storyteller, and the story I want to tell you today is really driven by my work in seabirds, which I've been fortunate to have for 30 years. And it's one both of discovery and obviously of working with collaborators and pushing forward parts of conservation, which without so many people working towards the same goals, we really have no hope of getting too far ahead. But I want to drive this story by talking about the species which I've worked on back in the 90s, Gould's petrel, and you'll hear a little bit about that later today as well, and see how that sort of launched me into a number of rabbit holes that I went down. Okay, so this is Gould's petrel. It's Australia's rarest endemic seabird. It's mostly known from a small group of islands off Port Stephens on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. The principal one being Cabbage Tree Island, which is about a 30-hectare island and covered with rainforest, which is quite rare for our coastal islands, but has very particular attributes which Gould's petrel takes advantage of. It's not a burrowing pterodroma, so it lives in rock cavities, which is quite unusual. It's lost its ability to dig, although occasionally it digs its way out of some of the artificial habitat we set up. And it forages during the breeding season. There's Cabbage Tree Island there, mostly in the Tasman Sea off the east coast of Australia. And for those geographically challenged this morning, we're over here. The main problem was in the 1990s, only a couple of hundred pair of the species. And when I started working on it, the main problem was perceived to be a lack of breeding habitat, meaning the birds were exposed to poor weather, and a native bird lime tree which drops sticky seeds in January each year, which created issues for the birds coming and going when they were feeding their young. So we're obviously dealing with a southern hemisphere species here. When I talk about summer, it's sort of December, January, February. So we managed one of the issues when I arrived. We found a lot of Gould's petrel looking like this. With only 250 breeding pairs, we were losing about 6 birds a week to every pair of nesting currawongs, which are, there's the remains of some there. They're a type of corvid bird. We also had Australian ravens, which were basically discovering the birds on the forest floor because they nested amongst rocky boulders under cabbage tree palm fronds, and simply removed them and fed them to their young. And so my first job was actually to remove the nestlings of those species from the canopy, and we later started a shooting program. Now they're native species, these terrestrial birds, so it was like, you know, what's going on here? And one of the ways we were hoping to overcome this was to use nesting habitat that the currawongs and ravens couldn't get into. So I, with collaboration with others, came up with a form of nest box which worked in this very steep terrain, very rocky terrain. It had a reducer at the front, so only Gould's petrel could enter it. So there were larger wedge-tailed shearwaters. There was also little penguins on the island, and it would stop them entering it. But really what was underlying the issue was that rabbits had been introduced to this island about 90 years before and had removed pretty well all of the understory. So the island was looking quite open, and the species of birds that were being an issue weren't known from rainforests. And so they were coming into this altered habitat and gaining access to a petrel which had never come across this predator before, so didn't know how to deal with it, as most seabirds are on their remote islands. So to deal with the currawongs, we couldn't just keep shooting them. We obviously had to modify the environment. And so this led us to our first eradication program. It was rudimentary, to say the least. We were only trying to remove rabbits, European rabbits, and so we only had to get bait within 50 metres of the rabbits. And so we simply flew over in a helicopter and dumped bait with buckets out the door. We were GPS guided, sort of, but it wasn't a large island. The biggest problem was actually proving that the rabbits were gone. And so I spent 2 years walking many tens of kilometres on this small island looking for evidence of rabbits. However, because it was a single island location, the issue that you have is, well, there's always a catastrophe around the corner, whether it be rats being introduced or whatever. And because we had Boondall Island in the background, which we knew a small number of Gould's petrel bred on it, we decided to use it as a translocation site. And so we actually set up some condominiums there, and we translocated the birds 100 at a time, and I'll go into this a little bit more detail. So what happened was things actually improved. So the red is actually prior to us actually carrying out any conservation activities. The first jump in the yellow is when we started to take on the currawongs and ravens and stopped the nesting pairs getting broken up. And so this second group is the coming together of the pairs that constantly got broken up and finding new partners and finally staying with them. And then after that, we ended up with a fairly good population growth running between 800 and 1,000 pairs. So that was a really successful approach for the species. We obviously, you know, when I first started working on it, I thought I was working on a seabird, but I ended up working on an island ecology because you can't manage threatening processes without actually taking on the environment that the species works in. Obviously, it's a lot easier if your ecological issues that are impacting them are on the island they work on. It's much harder, obviously, if they occur at sea. But we were very fortunate. We had a plastic species that was happy to use artificial habitat and was happy to have various programs thrown at it. So we have tracked Gould's petrel, just for your interest. They come a little closer to Baja, but not quite here. They're mostly off the south of the Hawaiian Islands. Their distribution is not unsimilar to a whole bunch of pterodromas from our part of the world, where we find they progressively use sections of the southeast to northwest part of the Pacific for their non-breeding areas. So a lot of the New Zealand pterodromas fill in the gaps between the species. It's been fascinating actually to play with tracking, but I won't go into that as part of this talk. So the island itself, after we got rid of the rabbits, has improved dramatically. It's still not the rainforest that we need, the full cover. So we're still suffering from predation from the occasional currawongs and ravens. The bird lime tree is not such a big issue because the fruits fall out of the canopy and get caught up in the upper layers of the vegetation. So we're not getting sticky fruits gluing these birds' wings together and obviously opening them up to either predation or starvation. So it's been quite a successful approach for that island. But then we thought, well, why don't we use this as a model for islands in New South Wales, which was my remit with the government, that I was managing seabird populations across the whole of New South Wales. And so we set about trying to build our skill sets. So the first thing I want to talk about is the island restoration work that we've done, mostly in New South Wales, with Cabbage Tree Island for European rabbits in 1998. As I say, it was fairly rudimentary. There were several other islands in New South Wales that required some work. Brush Island, which was on the south coast, 30-hectare island, had black rats on it. And we decided to do a ground baiting program there. It was only 36 metres above sea level. You could access all parts of the island, and the local National Parks Office wanted to use it as a group development program, you know, so they all got to camp out there and put out poison baits. It was quite successful with 2 layers of baiting. Further south, we have Montague Island, Barranguba, which I'll talk about in more detail a little later. And we stepped up a little bit and got ourselves a fertiliser spreader bucket, used helicopters, and we were trialling 2 different bait sizes because this island had not just rabbits but also mice. So we wanted to see if mice were more likely to eat a 5.5 mil bait or a 10 mil bait, whether it had any difference in terms of bait uptake, which it didn't. And that was to protect a whole range of species that occur on all of these islands, several species of shearwaters, Ardena, some storm petrels on some islands, not these, as well as little penguins. But we were surprised what we got from Montague Island after we did the eradication. I'll speak up a little bit. Broughton Island was our next one. This is a much larger island up on the mid-north coast at 120 hectares, similar range of seabird species, but we were dealing with black rats again and rabbits. And we slowly got our PPE organised and made sure that we were wearing the right gear for spreading the poisons. But we also had some housing on the island to deal with, and this was really important because our eye was on a much larger prize. There were 7 fishermen's cottages that were pretty well used all the time, and so we had to make sure that we got bait into subfloors and into roofs and not into their water tanks. And so that was an interesting process. They were pretty much for it because they would be catching their fish on the rocks on the island and putting them behind them and then go to catch another fish, and then a rat would come and take the fish that they'd caught previously. So always a bit of an issue for them. So they were very happy when we said we'd get rid of rats and also the rabbits, which weren't such an issue for them, but it was certainly an issue for the ecology of the island and the vegetation. As I said, the eye was on the prize, and the prize was a much larger island off the east coast of Australia, Lord Howe Island. You may have heard travel logs or seen David Attenborough getting showered by Providence Petrel on the tops of the mountains here. Spectacular island group. Whoops, sorry, that went a bit quick. So 1,400 hectares with about a 2,100 hectare in-surface area, 600 metre vertical cliffs, and remote, 580 kilometres from the Australian mainland. And so you couldn't just fly a helicopter to it. You have to put the helicopters on boats, take them out there with a mechanic, all that sort of stuff. So the idea of doing an eradication here was a significant challenge. So it has endemic terrestrial birds, including a flightless rail, which got down to 22 individuals in the 1970s, which the general public were very keen to see thriving. It has endemic reptiles. It has land snails, 150 species of land snails. So the biodiversity on this island is extraordinary. It has 104 endemic plant species with 3 endemic genera, hundreds of species of endemic insects, 13 species of summer and winter breeding seabirds, which was obviously the hook that got me there in the first place. And particularly it's a World Heritage Area with the reefs and the landscapes protected. And so there were lots of eyes on what we were trying to do. So it is a permanently habited island with 350 residents, up to 400 tourists at any one time. There's a limit on beds, so they don't get over-tourism there. Lots of buildings. They have domestic dogs. They've got cattle, well, small amounts of cattle, chickens, horses. We also had to build a captive management facility for 2 terrestrial birds. I could do a 40-minute talk just on Lord Howe, so I'm going to be very brief, unfortunately, with this. 10 years of planning, well, probably 15, as was said in the introduction. 15.4 million Australian dollars, originally set at 9.8 million, and then it blew out because of lots of reasons. A cluster something, people were describing the whole event. And $33 million in biosecurity. And this actually occurred, this funding occurred afterwards, after the eradication, not prior to. And 2 potential court injunctions while the eradication was being started. Because it's an island community, and anybody who works with island communities realise they are fiercely independent. And as fiercely independent people, if it's not their idea, it's not on, because usually they have an issue with the controlling authorities that manage them in some way. And so while the islanders hated rats and mice, which is what we were targeting on this island, they hated the local controlling authority even more. And so it was about getting back at the controlling authority rather than actually any conservation outcome that was the main aim for a lot of people on that island. So it was a flabbergasting situation where we as scientists approached it like, oh, well, surely if we provide you with good argument for every one of your concerns, we're going to solve this issue. And we were the wrong people to be speaking to them. And anybody who attempts an eradication thinking they can solve it by rational science, you're wasting your time. So, huge amount of people involved in the eradication. We were employing up to 1/3 of the adults on the island, so there was a lot of good employment. A lot of specialists flew in, and these were the people just doing the actual dropping of the bait. It was our team of 4 that had to manage the biodiversity, the bait uptake. We had to manage the residual bait in the environment. We looked at water, we looked at soils. We had to manage the terrestrial birds, endemics that weren't in captivity. So we had to make sure that they weren't getting wiped out by the eradication process in real time. And so it was a little bit of pressure, but nothing we couldn't handle really, because we've been working on the island long enough. We'd done a lot of studies prior to the eradication, so we knew a fair bit about the way the bait worked in the environment. We knew which bird species were likely to take the bait, so we took 2 of them into captivity, 100% of wood hens, pretty well, and funny enough, about 50% of a native currawong. So I was shooting them on one island and protecting them on another. This was a subspecies here. So the outcomes. One of the most important outcomes, and this dead rat in the foreground reminds me, is that, that on Lord Howe they didn't think about biosecurity really until after the eradication. So up until 18 months after the eradication, everything's sweet. They're running detector dogs, no evidence of anything. And then 9 rats turned up in 1 month. Now, it was suggested, oh, maybe they were residual population, which I don't actually believe. I haven't seen the genetic results, but apparently it's potential that they were residual. I do not know how they were not picked up. But to get rid of those 9 rats, which then over a few months bred up to 94 rats, cost $2 million. So the idea of biosecurity has to be your number one thing alongside your cost-benefit analysis, your feasibility assessment, prior to undertaking any planning. Because if you don't understand how you're going to protect this benefit you are creating, you're really barking up the wrong tree. Small islands are relatively cheap, and it's an easy process, as I showed earlier with the ones that we were doing. And we've done several other islands in Australia on a shoestring budget. Non-target issues can create considerable obstacles and even be a deal breaker. And that's obvious because, you know, you can't wipe out your endemics. We couldn't take the Lord Howe woodhen offshore because we didn't want to bring disease back onto the island. And so we had to have everything in situ, which again, logistically, is a huge issue. The zoo who originally ran the program for us suggested it was going to cost $150,000. And then when we reviewed it after delays, they said $400,000. The budget came in at $2 million at the end. So it was a huge cost blowout. And so you've got to have very deep pockets or very friendly funders. Inhabited islands need to have the process driven by the community for success. And this is really critical because you can spend a lot of time planning and a lot of time thinking that you can convince people, and really you're not going to even get to first base. The seabird recovery, which is what we're all here for, is initially in breeding success for your extant species. But repopulation, is not surprising, is a long process. And you really got to be aware of outcomes which are unexpected. We know that rats take seabirds. This is a little shearwater chick being pulled out of a burrow by a black rat on the island. But once we got rid of the rats, the endemic food resources that were available in terms of invertebrates absolutely exploded. We've been looking at before and after, and it's been massive. And so the native bird species responded. So the woodhen that'd been studied on that island since the 1970s, and maximum maybe 200 birds in any one year, just grew and grew and grew. Now we're doing surveys, we're expecting somewhere near 2,000 of them in this next survey. But they have a penchant for seabirds. And so they are now pulling black-winged petrels and little shearwaters out of burrows and eating them, which they probably did prior to the rats getting there, but the seabirds were then distributed in places where the woodhens wouldn't do that. And so what we're now having to do is either make places available or watch this process unfold over the next decades, where the seabirds have to find the sites which are actually going to be safe for them to breed against things like woodhen. So one of the great advantages the seabirds have is the vegetation is changing dramatically, and it is creating barriers for a flightless woodhen that the seabirds can breed beyond. So there is going to be places for them. So we expect there'll be a very positive outcome here. So the next one I want to talk to you about is artificial habitat, which I fell into in 1992, but it's taken me on a very interesting journey. So with these plastic down under boxes, we employed them on several other islands for Gould's petrel. On Pinkertop, which is the top of Broughton Island, we introduced them there because we knew there were Gould's petrel breeding in a few rocky areas below the highest point of the island, but they weren't doing very well. So we put in some nest boxes, we put in sound attraction, playing calls, a New Zealand dock system, which is fantastic. And within 18 months, we had birds breeding in the boxes, which was wonderful for us because it just secured them on this other island. There wasn't a lot of habitat in terms of cavity habitat, but we can expand the nest boxes and make more available. What was interesting is we pulled in other species with the sound attraction as well. And this is a Pycross petrel, which is a New Zealand endemic. And what really surprised us about this bird coming in is the tracking work that has happened on it has shown that it actually is just east of New Zealand. It actually doesn't come into the Tasman Sea. So what it was doing on Broughton Island in amongst the Gould's petrel, we don't know. And in fact, I slipped a Pycross call, thanks to Graham Taylor, into the sound attraction, hoping to attract some more, because you can never have too many petrels. Okay, we also used them on Montague Island on the south coast. This was the island that we removed rabbits and mice from. It also used to have goats on it back in the 1980s. And Cabbage Tree Island on the mid-north coast, Montagu Burrunguba, which is the native name for the island, 450 kilometres south. Gould's petrel has never been known from there. But in 2012, I was carrying out some terrestrial bird surveys with the fellow who I'd worked with on Gould's petrel, David Pradell, for many years. And we were walking past this isthmus, and I was talking, as I do, very loudly. And a Gould's petrel called from the rock cavities nearby. And I said, oh, we should check that. That's a Gould's. And Dave said, is it? And he'd been working on the bird for 10 years. He never had a sound for the calls. And sure enough, we turned up Gould's petrel. We found a couple of nests in rock cavities. But interestingly, most of Montagu Island is a tussock grass. And some of the Gould's petrel have actually given up looking for cavities and actually burrowing behind the tussocks and making their nests on the surface. So it's a really unusual adaptation in this environment. We set up sound attraction, put in some artificial habitat to try and encourage them. They found plenty of cavities themselves. They have started using the artificial habitat, but other species also find them quite comfortable. So we've had other species that we use this. We produce a larger box, which we call the shear box for wedge-tail shearwaters. I work on penguins. That doesn't make me lose my status in the club? I hope not. So yeah, we work on little penguins in translocation. They've also been used in Bermuda in a translocation project there. They've been used for collared petrels in Fiji, as well as wedge-tail shearwaters. And while they have a great flexibility, there's a lot of positives about them, there's some negatives as well, which I will go into. The use of spun molded polyethylene has been taken up elsewhere. With the Chatham petrels, they use plastic boxes rather than wooden ones because they last so long in those really moist environments offshore. They've also got a plastic version of an original concrete burrow, which is used for the Cahao, the Bermuda petrel, to enhance the colonies there. You will notice that all of the habitat here has very strange entrances. This one is to stop a prion getting in, which is the problem for the Chatham petrel, and this is to stop a white-tailed tropic bird getting into the Bermuda petrel. So this reducer entrance was something which I employed very early on as well. I have dabbled in other bits of artificial habitat with white-faced storm petrels. When we found Gould's petrel breeding on Montagu Island, in that very same trip I found a colony of white-faced storm petrels which had never been bred on that island before. So that opened up a whole new area. I knew I had an endangered storm petrel or a threatened storm petrel on Lord Howe that I wanted to work on, but I knew nothing about them back in 2012, so I decided to work on the white-faced for a few years. But I ended up installing sound attraction and trialling exclusion barriers to actually get them back to other islands, because we realised they had a problem with a common and spreading tropical, pantropical shearwater, the wedge-tail shearwater. When the storm petrels bred in amongst woody shrubs, they chose sites for entrances which excluded the larger wedge-tail shearwater. But when they were choosing soil burrows, the wedge-tail shearwaters are really keying into any soil disturbance and actually go on to dig out their burrows. And what we were finding is 25% of the storm petrel burrows were being destroyed by wedge-tail shearwaters every year. And that sort of explains some of the behaviours we were seeing with the storm petrels, that they didn't stay long necessarily in their burrows. They would move around because they didn't like any disturbance. We actually had control burrows when I was studying to make sure that even just inserting a burrow scope wasn't enough to actually cause them to desert. And so I thought, well, how are we going to overcome this problem? So I came up with an idea of mesh. I thought, well, let's not make one burrow. Why don't I make a whole area accessible to storm petrels? And so what I did was I used a mesh which allowed storm petrels to get through, but the wedge-tail shearwaters could not. And I buried it at 400 millimetres down on the sides, covered areas that, on this island particularly, which is a weed-infested island, sprayed an area. I used, in this version, a spotter box, which is used in lawns for sprinkler systems, and it had some foam underneath the roof to stop heat being transferred into it, and just drain coil. Used that as artificial habitat. We tied the mesh down, we planted vegetation in it, and we used sound attraction to try and attract them to the island. The veg grew, the storm petrels were attracted. They didn't necessarily use the site initially. We had breeding on this island for the first time in 56 years after starting to do habitat restoration, removing a African kikuyu grass, which was basically transforming the island into a monoculture and providing habitat to suit the birds. They visited the site, didn't actually breed in my plastic boxes, which really disappointed me. But over time, they started burrowing into the sides of the mesh and building their burrows in these safe areas that the wedge-tailed shearwaters couldn't get into. Unfortunately, a thing called COVID-19 came along and the study had to stop. And unfortunately, with this grass, if you don't deal with it yearly, it takes over everything. I got back 18 months later and almost all the site was covered in kikuyu. So it's a long-term burn when you're working on islands to remove grass. So we also introduced this on several other islands, habitat on Montague Island, where the storm petrels I'd rediscovered, and we were trying to get them back to Broughton Island, which was our largest island in New South Wales for storm petrels, using a dual sound attraction, Goulds through one speaker, storm petrels through the other. Okay, so that was white-faced storm petrels. I'm going to take you on a short journey with the white-bellied storm petrel, which had a problem with little shearwaters. It was excluded from the main island of Lord Howe due to rats and mice, and on the outer islands it was in great competition with a slightly larger little shearwater. So we used a concrete perlite version of boxes to give them better thermal capacity, and we crushed a drain coil to stop the little shearwater getting in, but the storm petrel could get in. We also set them up on the main island. This is Roach Island where they currently breed, trying to drag them back to the main island with sound attraction. And they do seem to enjoy using the boxes, but we only put them in last year, so it's a slow burn with artificial habitat. So I want to talk about, which is my new favourite seabird, sorry Una, Kermadec petrel. It's a surface nesting petrel, so I've been so fortunate over the last 7 years to be able to work on a surface nesting species. Very few people get access to them because they occur on the most remote environments, because they occur where there are no terrestrial aerial predators. And for me, it was to get it back to Lord Howe, where it used to breed 100 years ago. Surface nesting bird. Interestingly, I'm sure you read that, breeds all year round. I've been to this island every 2 months for the last 7 years and never not been there without Kermadec petrel. They're there all year round. So just studying a year breeding seabird, which I'm only 7 years into, is totally fascinating. Their habitat that they use is surface nesting, but what we found is they actually like to be next to some sort of physical barrier, rock face or a log or a tree trunk. So we threw out a few of these simple alcoves, which gave them some protection from the weather, but gave them this back area which made them feel secure. It took a while, but they started using them. But on this island, we also have a problem with a swamp hen, a purple swamp hen. Here's one about to eat a chick that we picked up on one of our cameras. And it wasn't until we started managing the purple swamp hen that we started to get really good breeding success. It's gone from 22% up to about 50, 60%. And the number of breeding pairs, of course, has escalated because we've taken out this disruptor of nests, and so breeding pairs are now coming in and staying with their partners, but it's a slow burn. So what we've realised that not only do we have this problem on Phillip Island in the Kermadec group, but if we want to go to Lord Howe, we also have a problem with a couple of predatory birds there. So I thought, well, what if we put a camouflage over it so the currawong, the flighted bird on Lord Howe, couldn't easily see the chicks sitting there at 3 days old when their parents have left them. And then it'll also give us a nice sort of barrier, a stick barrier, because we found with the purple swamp hen that nests that had significant stick barriers of low-lying dead sticks in the bushes that they were nesting in, the purple swamp hens couldn't get into. So I incorporated both of these into these strange-looking units who... when I took a colleague there recently to where 20 of them were, he says, oh, this looks like a refugee camp, which I was most embarrassed with. It was a piece of very important scientific equipment. The birds love them. We've had 50% of them visited in the first year and have had more breeding in our alcoves that we had inside than we did over 4 years of alcoves out in the open. So they actually like this strange device we've created. And for us, it's really important because the currawongs on Lord Howe certainly enjoy seabirds. And as well, I've shown you, the woodhens will certainly enjoy them as well. But on Lord Howe, we actually have to place them where the woodhens aren't. So the trouble with that is that what does good Kermadec petrel habitat look like? Most of the islands where they occur have had browsing animals on them, so a lot of it has been destroyed and damaged. It was easy on Phillip Island off Norfolk where we were working. It was a terribly destroyed environment. Invasive African olive had created places where the Kermadec petrel liked to breed. But on Lord Howe, I had 1,400 hectares. Where the hell was I going to attract this Kermadec petrel to? Fortunately, someone had collected them there before rats. A guy called Roy Bell, and he's there with a couple of Kermadecs in his hands. And he'd left diary notes. So I went through his notes from 100 years ago and had a look at the habitat that he found these birds in. And so all it was finding sites that were of similar quality to the habitat where he had found those birds. So I selected a number of sites, both in the southern mountains and in the northern hills, and carting lots of gear with the help of others, because we have 30-kilo batteries and all the other bits and pieces that you need. We've set up sound attraction now at a number of sites, and so for the first time in 100 years, the calls of Kermadec petrel are ringing out in the mountains of Lord Howe, because the birds won't land unless there is a call happening on the ground. They'll just fly over. So they need to have calls to actually bring them in. Okay, so artificial habitat, great place to stick your kids when you're working in the field. For suitable species, it provides higher breeding success than natural habitat because you're removing the sharp edges. It's cheap, robust and long-lasting, at least 30 years for spun moulded polyethylene. And I do talk about that plastic because it's a food-grade plastic that does not degas when it warms up. Plastic warms up really quickly in the environment, and so you've got to be sure that you're placing them where they're not going to be an ecological trap for the species you're attracting. They provide easy access to breeding birds. They can house monitoring devices, be fitted with additional equipment like one-way doors for getting your loggers back. In application, beware of creating ecological traps. I mentioned heat. Another one is that you have to have environments that are incredibly stable. If you're putting in this habitat for long-term use, if it keeps getting erosion and filling up with soil, then you constantly have to keep opening the burrows, especially with a non-burrowing species like Gould's petrel. They get to the entrance and go, yeah, what's this? I'm not digging that out, and they won't use it. So you've really got to be aware where you're placing your artificial habitat. It can be forever. So you're creating, we've got birds. I mean, I've worked with Gould's petrel that were banded as adults 43 years ago. So you're creating an environment that has to last tens of years, hundreds of years. So be really careful about what materials you decide to use, because it's unfair on a species if you bring them to a new site and there's no way of them to find natural habitat that they'll eventually lose out. Okay, so I did mention that we were working on translocations. So I want to talk about that science of translocation, and we carried out a trial translocation in 1995 to 1998 on Cabbage Tree Island. We were really lucky that the Gould's petrel bred in these two gullies, one here and one here, and of the thousands of birds we've banded, less than 2% move between the gullies. They are very fixed, which is what we all know. So that allowed us to do a very simple experiment. So two independent gullies, we switched nestlings between the gullies. We based their age on their plumage development and their mass, but we've since added wing chord to that. We fed them at the same rate as control birds, and we looked at the emergence timing of control birds because we wanted to move them before they develop filipatry into their nests. We used the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. And so what we did was we literally fed them squid and fish, which bits of fish we stuffed into squid tubes and just pushed it down their throat. We only had to give them a few meals because we were only moving them right at the end of them being fed. The feeding frequency, days before fledging, we found they were fed every second day, 18 days out, every third day, 17 to 11 days out, and not fed after 11 days before they were due to fledge. The meal size was about 25 grams. They first emerged from their burrows at about 10 days before fledging, so the optimal age for translocation was obviously above that, between 11 and 28 days. So if you look at that and the numbers, you're not giving them that many meals prior to them actually leaving. And in fact, when they are ready to fledge, they will refuse food, even though you've got plenty of food sitting in the bucket. They don't want to know about it. So from the trial, we found no reduction in fledging success, no reduction in condition of fledglings, no disruption to the timing, and the translocated birds returned to the fledging site and to not their hatching site, even though it was only 150 metres difference. So from that, we looked at Boondilbar, we set up our condominiums. Looks beautiful when all the flowers are out. We created an ecological trap for them because of the erosional issues in the gully, so we have to keep opening the burrows every year. Yes. So we did 2 translocations in 1999 and 2000, about 100 birds each. We used wing length and weight, and we found with the wing length that there were no difference to the birds left on the island, and the weight as well. They were actually fledging slightly heavier than the birds left on Cabbage Tree Island. We also actually followed up the adults that we took the fledglings from, and we had a greater percentage of adults breed in the following year if they had chicks removed from them. It gave them that, it appears to have given that little bit of break. Towards the end, they ended up migrating earlier and coming back in better condition to breed. So actually taking chicks away from adults gave a better breeding success in the following year to compare to birds that didn't have chicks taken away. So we monitored the colony quite regularly for about 13 years, almost 130 adults. Only 12% of those, even though we moved 200 birds, only 12% of those 128 were our translocated birds, but that was enough. We pulled in some banded birds from Cabbage Tree Island. This figure really does my head in. The amount of banding I did over 10 years on a small island, and we still had 71% of unknown birds. That was a trick. And obviously some came from the colony itself over the years. So almost 300 eggs, 54% breeding success. Gould's petrel during those years usually manages somewhere about 48, 49%. So a better breeding success and lots of fledglings. So it also allowed us to downgrade the species in Australia from endangered to vulnerable based on the fact that we had a second positive colony. I carried this technique to Bermuda, working with Jeremy Medeiros. This guy is just so committed to his petrels, it's not funny, and anybody who's met him will realise he'll talk till the end of the day about them if you give him a chance. A bit like me, really. And I started the translocation with him in 2004, and he can't let a good idea go. So he carried out for 5 years, moving 105 birds to Colony A, what eventually became Colony A. 50 birds are returned by 2020. He couldn't help himself. 2013, he decided, let's do Colony B. So this is to Nonsuch Island, which is an island only about a few hundred metres from some of these offshore islands. And so that's still, the data's still coming back on that island. So he's only had 16 birds returned by 2020. And in 23, they had 40 breeding pairs on this new island. It's the second largest colony for the species, producing 19 fledglings. And this year, they're talking about 26 fledglings. And what's really interesting, I mean, they use those concrete and sometimes plastic devices for them to breed in. They've got birds breeding for the first time in soil burrows in over 300 years, because on the outer islands, there is no soil. This is their breeding habitat. They nest in rock cavities, but they're actually a soil burrowing bird. And so now on Nonsuch Island, much to Jeremy's frustration, they're in these deep burrows he can't get them out of, but you just have to get used to it. Okay, so the outcomes of translocation, prerequisite of good provisioning and emergence data. Ideal translocation sites should require little upkeep to retain optimum breeding conditions. Fenced areas should be a last resort because fences are so costly and so time intensive to maintain in the long term. Nobody has that sort of funding stream, and you've just got to hope governments feel as strongly about them as you do. Provisions of artificial habitat is only temporary. They're translocation housing. I mean, with Gould's petrel, we had to use them in Boondalbar because there wasn't much habitat. But really, you want the birds to do what they do naturally because they know how to deal with all the problems that they might occur in their natural housing. Having local community invested in translocation sites can provide long-term on-site support. And if you've obviously got weeds to deal with or potential predators or whatever, this is actually critical because we're only around for so long and these birds are going to be here for decades to centuries. One of the tools, which was one of the more fun tools that I worked with, was detector dogs. I went to the Chatham Islands in the early 2000s to work with this guy, Steve Sawyer, working on the magenta petrel, only 22 breeding pairs at the time, so every new pair they could discover. And Bo did a brilliant job at finding both new birds and new areas that they were breeding in. And so it led me to see this is a fantastic tool, obviously, for cryptic species in difficult environments. So I got Steve involved in the Fiji Petrel project with Dick Watling, and he trained up a couple of dogs and trained some Fijian handlers. We also had the handlers come to Australia and learn petrels. I did some petrel work with them as well. And even though we had a crew of three petrel biologists, 2 from New Zealand, myself, working for about 4 months in the mountains of Nau, which is the 5th largest island in Fiji. We failed to find Fiji petrel. Found collar petrel, which was fascinating. The largest colonies in the world now are known on Nao Island. But even now, the Fiji petrel is still elusive. It is still there, hopefully, but we couldn't find it. And these dogs went on to work on the island for 4 or 5 years before they eventually succumbed to disease. And they found lots of collar petrels, but not Fiji petrel. But a fantastic tool. So in Australia, we started working with a guy called Steve Austin, the $6 million man, and he provided us with dogs for initially for working on penguins. He was training dogs for the Macquarie Island eradication, and so I first brought him out to Broughton Island, where he wanted to run his dogs next to seabirds to make sure that they would just go for looking for rats or rabbits in this case. But I eventually obtained a dog which was originally trained up to work on penguins and also finding cats and foxes for mainland sites for brush-tailed rock wallabies, which is an endangered rock wallaby on the east coast of Australia. But I was fortunate enough to have some time to train the dog up for Gould's petrel as well, which it did quite well with. So the outcomes. They're a powerful tool, obviously, for detecting cryptic species. Difficult to utilise to their full potential within really steep or heavily vegetated habitat. Their legs are only so long. Long-term and significant time commitment, both to house, to train both the dog and whoever the handler is, because both of you need to be refreshed all the time, and to keep the dog detection abilities current. And the most effective application of time and financial commitment is if the dog has multiple target species skills, so both a predator as well as a species detection. Now, the work that I've done, as I said, I stand on the shoulders of others. You know, none of us are independent here, and I also stand alongside others, and I just want to mention a few people. Dave Pradell, who I worked with for 20 years. He didn't have a very good ear for seabirds, but he was a great manager. Lisa O'Neill, who's my partner of the last 25 years, but is also a seabird biologist. And as we all know, when you actually do long time in the field, it's the people at home that keep the wheels turning, and that's really important. She's also bloody brilliant to have in the field because I don't have to tell her anything. Terry O'Dwyer, I've been working with for almost a decade. He did his PhD on Gould's petrel. Excellent biologist, great writer, and except for his passion for golf, I understand him totally. And another fellow called Chris Lloyd, he's a volunteer. He's been a volunteer for me for more than 10 years. And if you work in science, you probably are well aware that you can't survive without volunteers. And these people are absolutely invaluable. This guy is actually a materials person. He's originally a fitter and turner, and he brings a whole range of new skills when you're trying to work out new ecological tricks to deal with things. So volunteers are the lifeblood of our science. There are obviously mentors that I worked with overseas, David Wingate in Bermuda, Frank Zeno in Madeira, Dick Watling in Fiji, Peter Fulliger in Australia, who was my long-term mentor, Jeremy Medeiros also in Bermuda, and Kerry Jane Wilson in New Zealand. But it's not only the mentors, it's also the students that we work with that become our collaborators and our friends. And what I find interesting is my collaborators and the people down the bottom, there's a single female in that, but more than 50% of my students are women, so we're slowly turning the tide. Okay, this is the kicker for me, and I've only got, I've got a little bit longer. I'm going all right. Okay, so this is actually an artist's impression, and you can barely see it. These are wind turbines about 10 kilometres offshore. They're not there yet. This is the east coast of Australia. The continental shelf is only 20 kilometres off the coast, and so it drops away very quickly. So these are deep water wind turbines. It's a technology that's only just being developed. There are only two current model turbines, one in Malaysia and one in Japan that they're trialling, although in Norway they are starting to use the deep water system. And we're talking about the east coast of Australia here. Okay, so these things are not fixed to the seafloor in anything up to 300 metres of water. So they are anchored to the seabed using various systems. They have 700 tonnes of ballast to keep them upright. And they have a blade height, which a single blade is the length of a NFL field. Or if you're into other sports, it's more than the sweep of the blade is bigger than the Melbourne cricket ground. So these things are huge. And in fact, a single set of turbines off the east coast of New South Wales will produce more energy than all our terrestrial wind turbines in New South Wales put together. These things produce a lot of energy. The advantage is, and as any sailor knows, that the wind is strongest and most constant at night. So in terms of green energy, it's a perfect foil for solar, which we obviously have in abundance in Australia. Now we know there are a lot of risks and challenges. These are the risks down this side, and obviously seabird collision and avoidance. It's nothing unusual for people who come from the Northern Hemisphere working with their seabirds. There are several other issues, including even the energy cabling, taking it back to the mainland, creating electromagnetic fields. The positives are no-brainers, reducing CO2 emissions. They do actually have an artificial reef effect. Huge swathes of the seafloor can no longer be bottom trawled. So some of the fish biologists are going, not bad. And obviously connectivity for desired species. But the top one is the one that really worries us. And being from the Southern Hemisphere, where prosolarids outnumber anything else by an absolute country mile, it is a great deal of concern. When you look at the heat map of species diversity for seabirds, it's obvious that northern New Zealand wins the prize, but across the Tasman we also have significant numbers of species. If you actually look at the wind energy available, it's a very similar heat map. Isn't that interesting? So I know that our Northern Hemisphere colleagues have been struggling with this for 30 years, but we're entering new waters, so to speak, and we're also entering where the species dominance is very different to what happens in the Northern Hemisphere. So I'm attempting to run a project in New South Wales called Icarus. It's a 5-year industry-funded research project to fill the knowledge gaps and contribute to the avoidance, mitigation, offsetting of development impacts, particularly for breeding seabirds in New South Wales. I can do something about that. So we target the breeding seabirds most commonly seen in the coastal waters, and I'll go through these just to give you an idea. Gould's petrel, obviously, Providence petrel from Lord Howe, flesh-footed shearwater, also from Lord Howe, sooty tern, probably not a big threat, also from Lord Howe. But the reason I show you these is if you look at the seabirds that are impacted in the Northern Hemisphere, it's totally flipped. There might be 1 or 2 prosolarid species if you're lucky, and all the rest are terns and gulls, and obviously your auks. So we're dealing with a very different group of birds in the Southern Hemisphere, and this thing's coming like a freight train at the moment, so we have to be on our guard. Wedge-tailed shearwater, so not a threatened seabird, and when the government looks at these things, they're most worried about threatened seabirds. This is our most common seabird in New South Wales, and where one of the wind farms they're planning to put in, there are 200,000 pairs that breed less than 15 kilometres away. So for us, as a biological imperative to maintain quality of terrestrial environments by bringing in nutrients, we don't want to lose our wedge-tailed shearwaters because our islands will go into decline. So there are 3 tiers to this. It's population assessment. We don't know what we've got until we know what we've got. Tracking studies, obviously, and experimental mitigation management, offsetting. Now the population assessment gives us our baseline of changes that can be measured. And for me, particularly if you're tracking smaller birds where you can't use an automatic download, it identifies individuals for intense tracking studies. You've got to get a bang for your buck for the instruments you're putting on, and we need to get as wide a range of birds as possible. So if you don't know they're good solid breeders, you're going to lose your gear before you get them back. 2 seasons of study, because that's all we're really going to be allowed to do in terms of timing. Obviously using GPS, not only location but also for flight characteristics, using air pressure sensors, and global light sensors, which we can put on lots more birds for obviously a lot less money, and gives us a percentage of population visiting coastal areas, in mind that the GLSs are plus or minus 150 to 400 kilometres, but at least it gives us something. And the experimental mitigation is about increasing breeding participation and securing colony productivity, getting better breeding success out of our birds that are there. Currently, the bottom one is unfunded. The federal government's interested in that because they have barely thought about it in Australia, and it's something that I've had obviously a fair few years thinking about with our offshore islands in New South Wales. So the program does not address the species that frequent coastal areas but breed elsewhere. So we're talking about our albatross, we're talking about a whole bunch of endemic New Zealand petrels that come over, like the grey-faced petrel. It doesn't deal with the non-breeding individuals, even from our breeding birds, because obviously our tracking stuff only goes on birds that are actually breeding. So there's still lots of holes in the data that we can collect. Frequent visitors can be in low numbers but significantly threatened. such as the albatross and petrel, but they require on-island studies in other jurisdictions. We've yet to fight for that, but it's going to be a battle that's got to be fought because we can't pretend that they're not going to be an issue just because they don't breed nearby. Non-breeding individuals from local species are difficult to predict and they could be significant in numbers. So this is something we have to work on as well, and unfortunately a 2-year tracking study is not going to answer that. So the experimental management mitigation, this is offsetting collision impacts. Obviously we can deal with turning turbines on and off at particular times, and for things like Gould's petrel that might be every night for 6 months because they actually attend Cabbage Tree Island from over 300 metres above sea level to fly down onto the island. Their original parent population is New Caledonia that breeds at 600 metres, so maybe Gould's hasn't lost that penchant for coming in from on high. We don't know at what point out at sea that they climb to 300 metres. If it's through a wind farm, that's obviously a disaster. Island-based activities targeting breeding or potential breeding colonies. We remove invasive mammals, that's an obvious one. We put significant effort in weed management, and it's at 5 to 10 years, and I might even double that, 10 to 20 years of effort to actually manage some of the weeds that we have on our islands. But the difference they make for breeding participation is amazing. This is an area in the foreground that was sprayed only a few months before, and we had people, we were doing some penguin counts, and they had their tents set up where there were no seabirds burrowing. The next morning, their tents were covered in soil. Shearwaters were coming in and just going, oh, this is free, awesome, and just started digging their burrows. So in terms of participation, it takes off very quickly. Augment breeding habitat, obviously artificial burrows is one way of doing it. Re-establishment of breeding colonies using all those skills to draw birds in. Exclusion of competitors for smaller seabirds, such as our example with the mesh. And restoration of breeding sites, reparation, actually fixing up habitat that has been destroyed. And there's a nice example here on a place called Muttonbird Island. About 100,000 people walk along this track every year, and it's right through a wedge-tailed shearwater colony. They obviously don't all walk on the track, they collapse all the burrows on the side, and so they've lost thousands of square metres of habitat. But in installing a walkway and releasing the soil, they've actually created a whole bunch of new breeding areas for seabirds that they previously couldn't get access to. And in fact, I would take this even further with some of our deeper burrowing species. You can actually make these walkways with artificial habitat underneath them, so you can actually get in and study these birds. So you can take it even further. And that can have a significant contribution, because once you start having a standard set of burrows, you can look at breeding productivity, and it gives you some idea of cohort returns over time. You can actually work out what sort of numbers you could be losing and not losing, if you know what I mean, if you have that long-term data. So we've been working all our lives to try and get the best out of our endangered species, to try and find out where they're breeding, to try and reduce predator issues, to try as we can in many different and varied ways to understand what's going on. Now what we need to do is to apply it to all our seabirds. So it's not about just our rare and threatened species, but it's about all the species that are going to be of collision risk. And this doesn't last forever. The technology that's about to be introduced is only, 30 more years, and we're going to have a different energy system in place. So it's really about getting them over the next few decades. We will see species reduce. We obviously are going to be more worried about our threatened species, but even our more common species, we've got to get them over this hump without the islands they're breeding on losing their productivity, the nutrient input, and the bitubation, the soil turnover. We've got to get through it. And it's going to require all of us to put our brains together. It's happening in Australia. It's going to happen in New Zealand really soon. It's probably going to happen here off Central America and down through South America, because these things are worth a lot of money and they are a solution to the problem. They're not the only solution, but they're one that people are throwing a lot of money at the moment. So if you're a seabird biologist in the Southern Hemisphere, you're not going to be lacking employment in the next few years, that's for sure. About where I want to go with this. But I also threw some petrels along the bottom. How did you go? I'll put you out of your misery. Okay, these are all birds that occur on the one island. So in some years I have had 5 petrels at my feet, and I'd love to speak to anybody whether they've found an island that's better than that, because I'd like to go and visit it. This is Phillip Island off Norfolk, definitely worth visiting. Thank you.